Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre Boileau. I'm the head of the Global Environment Outlook program at UN Environment Program in Nairobi. We're very proud to be part of the Daring Cities initiative today, and we're just getting started with a series of presentations from some authors and the co-chair of the Geo for Cities initiative that we are undertaking right now. The Geo for Cities is a derivative product of the main Global Environment Outlook report, the 6th Global Environment Outlook report, which we released last year in March. And the 6th Global Environment Outlook report provides quite a number of startling statistics about the environment, but also some statistics about urbanization, the rate of urbanization, the fact that by 2050, 2/3 of people will be living in urban environments, but also that we need, in order to meet our environmental goals, to reduce the amount of fossil fuels in our global energy mix by about 80% by 2050. We need to grow about 50% more food, or to produce about 50% more food to feed the population, which will be about 10 billion in 2050. But we need to reduce the environmental impact of that food production by about 2/3. We also need to do an awful lot to reduce the amount of waste that we generate. We generate about 8 million tons of plastics that go into the oceans each year, and we need to be able to do something about that. Without ado, I would turn over to our very illustrious panelists today. Diego Martino, who is the co-chair of the Geo for Cities initiative, will start us off, followed by Giancarlo Delgado from the Autonomous University of Mexico, and Jeff Brugman from the Resilient Cities Catalyst. So can I turn it over to you, Diego, for the first presentation? Thank you. And I'll ask you to unmute. I think you might still be on mute. There, now you should be able to unmute, Diego.
Now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I was not able to unmute myself. Thank you, Pierre. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. While I speak, you will hear some background noises. I'm in an urban environment, so you will be joining part of the noise in Montevideo City. It's a real pleasure to present some of the advances of the Geo for Cities report, which, as Pierre was saying, is a derivative product of this other bigger report, the Geo 6. And I will just be giving a few figures to contextualize what Gian and Jeff are going to be presenting after me. So according to the UNDESA definition, around 55% of the global population is now living in urban areas. If we take the GHSL, degree of urbanization definition, probably we are closer to 70% of people living either in cities or towns and semi-dense areas. It's important to notice that more than half of those people living in urban areas are not living in megacities or in large cities. They are living, more than 50% are living in urban areas that are smaller than 500,000 people. And they will continue to grow. They are growing and will continue to grow at a faster pace. And 40% of the growth of cities from now until 2030 will happen in these cities. And they have a particular context in which many of the cities don't have the same human resources, the same financial resources as large cities and mega cities. So it's important to notice this fact of many people living, or more than half of people living in these smaller urban areas. Another fact that is important to consider is that those countries, this is in this axis we have the urban growth, how fast cities are growing or our countries are urbanizing, and the level of urbanization of these countries is down here. It's important to notice that those countries with lower levels of urbanization, which are urbanizing at a rapid rate, are also facing higher vulnerability. So it's a combination of high vulnerability, rapid growth, which makes it very hard also to make proper urban planning. Right now, around 1 billion people are living in informal urban settlements, and UN Habitat expects that by 2050, between 2 and 3 billion people will be living in informal settlements. So it's a staggering figure. It's a situation in which probably 30% of people are living in informal settlements, 30% of urban dwellers. However, people keep moving to cities because cities have opportunities. Here we see a Gallup poll, world poll, where we have rural areas, small towns, and cities in different income level countries. And in all cases, we see that life satisfaction is higher in people living in cities and people living in rural areas. And this is because there's more access to education, more access to health service, more access to employment opportunities, higher household incomes, which leads to this higher level of satisfaction. So we will be witnessing continuous growth of cities. 90% of this growth will happen in developing nations in the next 3 decades. Only India, China, and Nigeria account for 35% of that growth. And according to the International Resource Panel, 60% of the built environment that is needed to accommodate this urban population by 2050 still needs to be constructed. And the decisions that we make regarding the type of infrastructure that we build, the way we plan cities, the way we design cities, will have a lock-in effect, which tells us that the decisions made today are going to have an influence for the next 30, 40 years. So we are currently with a very narrow window of opportunity to make cities either be an opportunity to have a higher standard of living with a lower environmental impact, or continue under the current path. So with this context, the Geo4Cities presents a vision of how cities could look like in the future if we seize this opportunity. That's what Jan is going to be talking about. And we also show some of the pathways on how to reach that vision. And that's what Jeb will be presenting after Jan. So with this, I will pass it now to Jan for his presentation. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Diego. And happy to have Jan. I did want to mention that I forgot to say that if people want to ask questions, there is a questions window in the application, and we will be addressing those questions at the end of the 3 presentations. So please go ahead and enter your questions in. I'll turn things over to Jan for his presentation. Thank you, everyone. Jan, you should be unmuted now, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes.
Great, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Pierre, thank you, Diego. I don't think you can see my slides now.
We see a white screen, Jan.
Huh, just give me a second. For some reason, it's still in pause.
I have your slides, Jan, in case you need.
Could you? Yeah, please. Something is wrong with my computer now.
Okay, I'll change it back to Diego.
So I'm just gonna start while Diego put my slides. So first of all, as Diego was saying, cities need to transform in order to face this environmental crisis and climate crisis that we are currently on.
And when to move, John.
Excuse me?
Let me know when to move to the next slide.
Yeah, you can go ahead, please.
Okay.
Just go. Just keep going. Thank you, Diego. So cities are part of the climate crisis, but they are part of the solution. So that's the first message, and it's the same idea that Diego closed with. From the Geo for Cities report, we were identifying 3 broad interlinked urban areas of action, or what we call in the report urban realms. That each realm is a comprehensive, flexible vision for sustainable, resilient, and inclusive future of cities. And those 3 realms are circular cities, as you can see on the screen, resilient and sustainable cities, and social inclusion and just cities. And mainly, this is because there are a lot of asymmetries within cities, and because most of the urban challenge that we are going to experience in the next decade, as Diego was saying, will happen in developing countries. These urban realms are consistent with global convention and agreements, either in sustainability, disaster prevention, resilience, biodiversity conservation, and climate, meaning Agenda 2030 or the SDGs, the Sendai framework, etc., etc. Can you please, Diego, pass to the next one? So, Diego? So, as you can see in the next slide, if Diego can just show it to you, cities, these realms are a comprehensive vision of this urban transformation. It is composed by different subcomponents, and as you can see, circular cities. No, can you go back, please? Circular cities are have different subcomponents like food, water, energy, buildings, materials, waste, and emission. And one of the reasons we place buildings there is because they are a huge part of the material dimension of cities, and that will require particular attention. So transforming our cities will require a comprehensive approach of all these components and subcomponents, or realms and their components. And we need to identify the dynamics and forces that shape and reshape those realms and their multiple interactions. These realm components can have positive and negative synergies, and we need to work with them as well. So we can profit, co-benefits, but we have to pay attention to potential trade-offs. Just for giving you a clear example of some of the ways that we can envision this urban transformation, only from the first realm, the circular cities realm. We can talk about sourcing materials from waste flows, recycling industrial and household waste for manufacturing, e-waste recycling into new stocks for manufacturing, composting, recovery and recycling of demolition and construction activities to be reused in new buildings and infrastructure, renewables in homes, in businesses, even in industry, design and planning of off-grid districts or low carbon districts, building design, of course, closed loop consumer products, changing consumption patterns. We actually need a lot of work on modeling material flow analysis in order to assess and monitor and identify opportunities and gaps. But we can think of several more: water reclamation and recovery, generation of energy from waste and wastewater flows. So the idea is closing these material and energy flows. So in general terms, cities will have to design their economies. They will have to have an approach, a systemic approach for their own transformation. They will need to include this consideration on metabolic efficiencies and cradle-to-cradle material, energy, and water flows, along with the renewables sources of energy, as already said. They will have to explore novel financial schemes. That's that's a headache for several cities, mainly in developing countries, but elsewhere as well. And we need to transcend silo thinking and acting. And this is an issue that Jeff is going to talk a little bit more about. Besides supporting individual behavioral change, we need to think about cities that support as well institutional economic changes that are needed to accelerate their desirable transformation pathways. And in that sense, pathways will be diverse. There is not a one size fit all. Solutions will need to be tailored to local regional specificities of cities, and may need to work at different intensities and temporal and spatial scales that better respond to their own priorities, needs, capacities, and governance reality. So if we can just move to the last one. No, Diego, could you go to the previous one, please? So that is just the last slide. So just for closing, the general idea, and I know that all this is highly packed into 5 minutes, but I just want to conclude with the idea that the transition to circular cities will certainly face a lot of challenges. So we need to think about in an intelligent and evolutionary transformational pathways approach. This transition into an opportunity to make important ancillary changes, including the urban physical fabric and building urban resilience and sustainability, while addressing social inclusion and justice. So all these training and education programs, city-based coalitions and networks will play certainly a key role in these urban future visions. Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Pierre. And I'll just give now the floor to Jeff.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Very happy to have Jeb Brugman from the Resilient Cities Catalyst with us to explain to us the steps for moving forward. Jeb, I'm just going to hand you the presenter rights. Hopefully you can just click on show screen and you should be off and running.
See if that's working. Hi, thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Dion. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen. If you want to just run your slides, then we should be fine.
Good, good. So picking up on where John framed this out in terms of the overall domain in which we have elevated the realm of circular cities work, which covers many different aspects of cities, as John said, which have been in the past siloed together. What I want to add to that is looking at where we stand as city practitioners in developing a body of practice around transforming our cities to this kind of circularity, metabolic notion of how we manage resource flows within our cities. And when we think about practice development, we always develop practices in cities in response typically to some set of imperatives. So I just start with a high level to say, this is what is impinging on cities that are growing in the current century, and it started late in the last century, that we still are continuing a substantial urbanization through scaled production of urban landscapes, this outspill that has been talked about, the sort of sprawling of metropolitan areas. And that is adding to this overshoot of our global demands on natural resources that is leading to sort of underlying declines in the reproduction of the resources through all of the ecosystems that are a source of materials and food supply and energy for our cities. And then at the same time, cities that have peaked in their urban development cycle, like Western Europe, through that peaking and the flattening out of population growth as well, they're facing tremendous demands in terms of how they're going to keep their economies growing. So productivity is declining. And so it's within this context of these three imperatives or these three drivers that some years ago, some decades ago, cities started to respond by launching a variety of campaigns, sort of program or policy practice agendas. And we've seen, and as represented in this slide, that they've done that from a number of different angles. The World Health Organization in the 1980s started looking at how do we improve the productivity of our cities in terms of resource use to achieve health outcomes. Sustainable cities looking more at the resource base and a relationship with the natural environment. Just cities, the new agenda, or resilient cities, a more recent agenda that emerged really only in the last decade as a major agenda of work for cities. And one of these has, if we look back at our history and understand how the practices that have been building up within city planning and urban design and then with municipal management and policy making, that we've gone through similarly decades of work that is now accumulating to a confidence that we can begin to transform our cities along the lines of the circular cities notion that Gian has explained. So we started in the 1980s just with very basic programs. How do we recycle? How do we cascade the use of our material and our nutrient resources or organic resources in cities so that we get more productive value out of them? Substantial work started in the 1990s on how to increase the efficiency of energy end use. And so district heating systems using waste heat became a prominent agenda, and particularly in the OECD countries. They're in the same place as green procurement. So cities started, and ICLEI was a pioneer in this, sponsoring this event, looking at the procurement that cities do for their own materials and supplies and inputs from a life cycle analysis point of view, which dovetailed very much with efforts taking place in the private sector at the same time about how to increase eco-efficiency in supply chains and also use create more efficient resource cycles. In the greenhouse gas mitigation field in the last decade, sorry, 2 decades back in the late noughts, cities started thinking not just about greenhouse gas emissions management within their jurisdictions and their operations, but from a scope 3 perspective. They started thinking upstream about their emissions impact. And all of this is now accumulated into, I'd say, we have 3 headings for this category. Circular cities is what we're calling it today. There was an agenda very prominent in the German government, sponsored a lot of this work in the last decade, Urban Nexus, which I'll speak more to, and others talk about it as regenerative cities. Cities that are so productive in their circular use of resources and in their own primary production of energy or of food supplies that they actually can give back to depleted natural systems. And so it's within this context that we have to understand the evolution of a pathway that we've been building up layer upon layer, bodies of knowledge and practice over the last decades. And now we're in this moment where we have to bring it together as a body of work and figure out how we fill gaps. But we've leaned very heavily initially on eco-efficiency work that the private sector launched in the 1990s and early noughts. And now what you see, and this is a graphic from the International Solid Waste Association, in specific domains of municipal management or urban management, circularity has become an embedded concept. And it has done so much more in some domains than others. So in solid waste management, it's become a critical thing. In energy management, because of using waste heat, it's become a matter. But there are all these other domains that, like food supply is a more recent one, where we think about food waste and how to cycle nutrients are more recent. Now what we need to do is think about how that drives us to think about the redesign and reintegration of the systems and the utilities that are the foundation of our resource use within cities. And so this is a graphic from one of the cases that probably for many of you listening today is familiar. It was one of the first really transformative cases for a small city in Sweden, so a very privileged place, where they, over a period that took more than a decade, figured out and implemented the financing and the policy making, as well as just the technology, how to go about reintegrating their heat and the power and fuel generation through biofuels, integrating that with all of the organic waste streams, not only within the city from its abattoir and from its sewage treatment, but also from the rural agricultural hinterland, and how they created a whole nutrient, fuel, waste management cycle that allows them now to power their regional transit on self-produced biogas fuels and to return very substantial tonnage of nutrients back to the agricultural economy. And so what you see in this graphic is what used to be very siloed domains of practice have now been engineered and managed in a totally integrated way in order to achieve maximal efficiencies of those resource flows within cities. So I mentioned the work that the German government sponsored in the last decade, sometimes also in partnership with ICLEI, to launch this under the banner of Urban Nexus, where they're looking at water, food, nutrient cycles in a circular city point of view. And there still is this wonderful resource that BAMZ, GIZ published on a sort of a guidebook on how cities can go about thinking about what their circular city strategies would look like. And I won't go through all of this. This is the sort of 4 areas that document outlines in terms of the work to be done, but I want to focus in particular on 2 and comment on 4 as well. Before I go into 2 in detail, which is the last point of my presentation. It's important to recognize that as we develop new pathways for transformation of cities, there will always be multiple dimensions that require us to engage all of the operating areas of our cities together to design a new system of working. So there's always law and policy is needed. There's a technological engineering component, a design component that's needed. We need to think about how we bundle the policy objectives and the technology, what's possible in technology and design, into a delivery model that our operational units of the city, the waste management department, the transportation department, can actually do. And that involves retraining staff. It involves communicating and helping citizens change their behaviors so that they can behave in a way that supports a new system. And ultimately, that often requires the creation of new institutions that allow that integration across the different streams. And Linköping case is a case in point, where they had to create a new institution to manage the integration of those systems. So let me now just speak further, and I'll conclude on this point around integration. As this report highlights and is as critical in all circular city work, whether it's in the private sector or in the more complex environment of a city, city environment with all of its political and multi-systems complexities. We have to integrate in a number of ways. So cities, fundamentally, we've managed them designed them through the 20th century in very siloed, disintegrated ways. And so the work of circular cities is often about reintegrating. So reintegrating across scales, we need to reintegrate the way we have resource flows within cities, interface both policy and materially and technically and operationally from the neighborhood to the city jurisdiction, the municipal jurisdiction, to the urban region, and to the national scale. And systems are articulated at all those scales, and it's not until we get those systems working together to kind of cross-optimize that we can actually get the gains we seek through circular cities. With that integration across the scales of policy and planning and financing, we can now redesign the fundamental systems of our cities. And I cite the Linköping case as a case in point on that we have these legacy systems. They've been financed, and we have to transition through new finance to sort of create the financial rationale to fundamentally reinvest in those systems and change them and invest in their integration. And so that's a huge piece of the work where we integrate all of the resource flows in cities in the way that they can cascade resources from one system to another system. When we have new systems, then we need to deliver the services differently, right? So the facilities that we use or the utility services that are provided also have to change their models. So when we think about regional transit agencies switching fuels and having a dependency on regional biomass waste, we really need to think about, well, how do we redesign solid waste utility so that it is closely operating in sync with a regional energy production cycle. And so the solid waste utility in a case like Linköping now has an energy production component to it that may require both operational reorganization of the staff. It also requires, obviously, policy changes as well. And so ultimately, this allows us to begin to consolidate the way that professional disciplines work together, the way that municipalities do their planning and resource allocation together to eliminate those silos. And then the final integration comes down to us as individuals, as individual urban residents, that we need to think differently and behave differently around how we continue, how we support these systems. So in the cities that have the most advanced circular city energy systems, households need to manage their internal heating and cooling systems in a very different way. And that they're now interfacing with a district system. They just don't have their own household equipment, or people have to separate their wastes in different kinds of ways so that they have good quality waste streams into different systems. So our social behaviors have to change as well. And so to conclude, I think what we've done is over a period of decades, we've tested out a number of key practices that are critical components of a circular cities. We have a much bigger ambition now, given that those drivers and imperatives I talked about at the beginning that would demand us to increase the productivity of resource use and the benefits we get from limited resources in much more factor-fold levels. But we know what the process is of making those changes. And I think if we go back and understand what was the change process that got us from recycling to district heating to doing waste exchanges in our cities to creating broader systems reforms like were created in the case of Linkoping I present today, we already have a foundation of work that allows us to understand how to accelerate the reform and transformation of our systems to meet this objective. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeb. I've been trying to answer a couple of questions online, but I do have some here that I think our presenters could answer verbally. If we have a couple more minutes from the organizers. First question I have is for Giancarlo. As part of developing circular cities in Africa, how do we ensure gender diversity, equity, and inclusion in town planning practice for sustainable development? Jan, would you mind coming on and turning on your camera and giving us a little bit of background on that question if you have some answers for it?
Yes, I think that's a huge challenge that we face in general in the developing world in particular. And I think that there are a lot of structural issues and characteristics that we already have in cities. And while climate and environmental crisis deepens, those structural challenges will become more and more relevant. So I think that's an issue of justice, that's an issue of participation, and each city, each country has different governance characteristics and contexts that will need to be very inventive in ways of actually promoting and supporting social participation in planning, in monitoring actions, etc. So there are several exercises around the world in terms of a participatory budget, in terms of citizen networks, etc., that may empower citizens and women in terms of how the city is being transformed towards this sustainable and low carbon vision that we just presented. That's what I can say, because the specificities will vary city to city.
Thank you, Gian. A question for Diego, if I might ask him to come on. Diego, there's a question that maybe you and I can both answer. What is the connection between the Geo for Cities and the Geo 6 report? Is the concept of circular cities reflected in Geo 6? What is the added value of the Geo Cities report? Does the report have substantial content on a response to the COVID-19 crisis? Maybe, do you want to answer both of those, or would you like me to answer one of them?
I'll try to go quickly through most of them, and I might leave some for you. Regarding the last one, the report is being written, or was being written, in parallel to the development of the COVID crisis. So we are mentioning the COVID crisis. We are trying to analyze some of the issues in regards to urbanization and the COVID crisis, but I wouldn't say we are giving substantial content in response to the COVID crisis, because it's an unfolding crisis. And it would even be irresponsible to come out with substantial content in response to an ongoing crisis on which we don't have enough information yet. Regarding the concept of circular economy, is it reflected in GEO6? It's not reflected in GEO6, the circular city. It is reflected in the GeoCities report. So no in GEO6, but yes, it's going to be in the GeoCities. And the connection between the Geo for Cities and the GEO6 report, basically the GEO6 report gave a hint of the situation of cities around the world, of urbanization as a driver of environmental change, and we wanted to produce more information and provide more information and more information, particularly on policies regarding to urbanization in this GeoCities report. So that's the GEO6 report provides the background on the environmental situation, and the Geo for Cities goes into the focus of the urban areas. I think I responded to all of them, Pierre, but if I missed one, let me know.
Yeah, just a small addition. What we're trying to do with these additional reports that are sort of derivative products of the main Geo is to delve into the question of how a specific group can address the findings in Geo. Geo does a good job of identifying what the problem is, but not how to solve it. So the idea of the Geo for Cities, the Geo for Youth, and the Geo for Business is to really look at the how question. Thank you very much.
One more issue, Pierre,
yep.
is that we're trying to focus not just on climate change issues in cities. We're trying to go beyond the climate change and getting into broader environmental issues, but also going beyond big cities. We're trying to also focus on different size cities. That's what we have. That's why we have in the opening chapter a mayor from a small town in Africa and an ex-mayor from a big city in the north, because we're also trying to balance the examples and the case studies in north and south. So those are some of the things that we're also trying to tackle in the report.
Thank you very much, Diego. If I can quickly turn to Jeb for second last question here. Jeb, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera and your audio. The question is, while we have the concepts and frameworks in place, what kind of tools and approaches are still needed, do you think? How can organizations like ICLEI better facilitate the take-up of the circular economy?
Yeah, thank you. So I think as often the case when we're developing a new pathway or a new entire body of practice, we have to recognize that no city has really gotten it yet. That's not the stage we're at, where this has now become the norm of the way cities design and manage themselves. But in all of the domains, as I was highlighting over the years, we have examples of practices that are part of the larger equation. And in particular, we've made progress in the energy and related to the imperative of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So now we have a whole framework that now a number of city networks, not just ICLEI, C40, a number of others, use to establish a domain within the city that is across all departments and operations of how to do baseline emissions tracking of their greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, to track the management of the energy cycle within the city. So it gives us a case of what a system might look like. We already have built it out in some areas. I'd say in the water cycle similarly, where I think we're still supporting the early best practices is in the materials cycle. So I think the challenge of the private sector being the major source of materials being brought into the city, and then the city having to do with the secondary and tertiary use of those materials from a waste management perspective. There are some examples I know in my own city, Toronto, for just serving a small part of our huge business community here, a city of 7 million people, we have a waste exchange where one of the public agencies helps businesses grab from each other's waste streams. But this has been talked about for a long time, but I think institutionally we're very weak in this area. And similarly, perhaps in the food systems sense, this urban-rural integration and our relationship as food producers and nutrient providers into an agricultural system is still very formative. So to address the question to the ICLEI World Secretariat colleague, I think what we can do is learn from, in particular, the greenhouse gas management, the energy management frameworks we've put in place and how we've inculcated them into city operations. But now we have to integrate minimally all 4 of those resource flows into a kind of baseline, an efficiency tracking, and now the new dimension of is how to understand the cycling of resources from energy, water, waste streams, nutrients streams, and material streams with each other. And you know, I know there are tools out there of people trying to do that, but I guess my first recommendation would be that the ICLEIs and the UNEPs now form some kind of R&D project with a group of representative cities and actually co-create those processes and those tools together. And then from that, now that you've proved them out with a body of cities, then scale them up to ever larger cities on a country basis.
Okay, thank you, Jeb. I need to check with the organizers. We have some good questions coming in, but I don't know if we have time to be able to handle them. Shazhana, are you able to give us a bit of a heads up on how much more time we have?
Yeah, it's fine. You can go on. It's not a problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have a question. Hopefully Gian can come on line related to the tension between greater efficiency, circularity, and resilience. Is the resilience of a city adversely impacted as its systems become increasingly circular? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, just a very general comment is that not necessarily, but yeah, we know that if we are looking for redundancies in systems for achieving greater resilience, that could be a trade-off in terms of efficiency. So cities will need to generate good knowledge on vulnerabilities and risks that they are facing now, and those type of risk and vulnerabilities that they expect in the future, in order to take a balanced decision in terms of how much redundancies they will actually need and how much they can achieve in terms of efficiency. So this is something that each city will need to figure it out in terms of their own context and expected future.
Next question to Diego. COVID seems to have at least questioned the necessity and attractiveness of some aspects of urban life. Should we accept the continuing growth of cities as a given? More of a philosophical question, I think, but hopefully you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Laszlo. It's very nice to hear from you as well. Long time since we last met. I would say, can we imagine a different path to help people get out of poverty, that it's more efficient than urban living? I don't know if COVID questioned the necessity or attractiveness of urban life, but we do know that in order to raise quality of life without putting further pressure on the environment, we will need cities. We need cities because they're probably a lot more efficient in helping us in that development path. So, and the other thing is that it's not just any urban living that might be questioned by COVID. It are certain types of situations in urban living that might be questioned by COVID, and the question of density, for example, was in the media quite a few times, and actually some cases from New York, for example, show that areas with more density are not necessarily linked to more quicker spread of COVID. So I also think that we still need time to analyze a lot of the data that is coming out from the situation before we can question some of the aspects of urban living with regards to COVID.
Good, thank you, Diego. Hopefully that was helpful. So next question is to Jeb. Jeb, who are the actors that will be supporting cities in acting upon the recommendations from Geo4Cities? Are there key implementing partners that that cities will need to have to collaborate with? Jeb, if you could come on with your video again, thanks.
Can you see me?
Not yet.
Okay. How are we now?
There we go.
Good, thank you. So there are many actors, and I was gonna at the same time respond to the question from Thompson as well. The business associations, as I've mentioned, whether it's World Business Council or the professional associations like the International Solid Waste Association, the city networks themselves, ICLE and C40 and other city networks, all of them are already on this agenda. And I think the issue is how cities bring themselves into those networks and demand that those networks build up programs to support them further. And of course, the funding has to be secured for those things. So in terms of external resources, I think there's substantial. Thompson's question picks on it from a different angle though, which is internally, who are the actors in the change process? And if I can just briefly say three things about that. For transformations of this nature, it takes a leadership cadre with a vision that can articulate what the circular city looks like. In other words, what are the benefits of this integration and going through this change? What is the vision of the city? And I think to date, what we have found is that there are pioneering thinkers and practitioners within, say, the utilities of a city. And they push things forward within the framework in which that utility has to operate and is constrained by policy and regulation. But it takes that broader leadership to embrace this agenda as a vision for how the city is going to be both more resource efficient, but also more resilient in order to start that cross silo integration process. As I say, within the utilities specifically, there's always work on how to optimize better. There's always resistance as well within the sort of bureaucracy, if we can refer to it that way. And so the third point I wanted to make is cities need to give incentives to their staff to be thinking in terms of integration, to be budgeting in an integrated way, to be working across utility in order to come up with policy reforms that will allow those two, firmly separated areas of operations from being able to work together with one another. So there's a lot of change management. So there's another question, if I may, about how do the cities of the Global South get the technologies? In my mind, there are soft to complex, expensive technologies. But the technology of creating an efficient waste nutrient cycle is not a heavy technological burden. It's actually an institutional burden. It's really a matter of how, in this case, the integration needs to be between the formal waste collection system and the informal sector waste collection system, and how to understand the informal waste collection system and how it cycles back nutrients to people who are growing their own food within a sprawling, largely informal city of the Global South. How to make that one system rather than competing systems. And so generally, I think it's professional training and institutional reorganizing that is led by a strong visionary leader that's needed much more than technology at this point. Okay, and I'm sorry I have to leave to go to the next meeting, but it's been lovely being part of this session. I hope my comments.
Okay, good, thanks, Jeb. Good, there are still some people hanging on, so I'm glad that we can try and get to some of these last questions. One for Giancarlo, if you have time, Giancarlo, about the role of artificial intelligence, machine learning in planning and managing systems, cities. Do you have any sort of experience with that?
Well, I know that it has been used and is being currently used, for instance, in certain cities in California, in order to get information, more precise information to plan, for example, mobility policy regulation. There are certain very early initiatives in the Global South, but this is very restraining, not only because of technological access and all these steps that we need to take to make partnerships with big companies. I'm not going to say the names, but that's one of the constraints for the Global South. So I think in the Global South, one of the main challenges is not necessarily, I mean, it would be good to have this big data analysis and capacities to inform policymaking and decisions. But I think there are a lot of structural challenges that we already know how to solve them, not necessarily with technologies, but more about behavioral changes, institutional changes, etc., as just Jeff said. So I think we need to work a lot on that. There are a lot of security or insecurity issues in Global South cities that need to be also be part of the agenda, because that can constrain participatory processes, even institutional projects when they are trying to be implemented on the ground. So I think that could be our main approach in the Global South, while we work on these new technologies and see how we can engage with that.
Okay, thank you. So a mix of technological and non-technological approaches. One question for Diego here. Did your analysis in your studies, what was the role of spatial scale in the sustainability of cities? What is the optimal dimension of a city from a resource efficiency perspective? Diego, that sounds like a tough one. Are you able to at least give us a little bit of background on that?
I can try. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Francesco, for the question. Can I share a screen for 30 seconds, Pierre? Okay, maybe I can't. Oh, yes, I can. So sorry, it's in Spanish. It's from a class from last week. But this graph shows population on one on this one on this side, and the other metrics on the other, and it shows how this superlinearity between population size of the city and GDP income patterns. So it does show that as cities grow, they become powerhouses in terms of economic opportunities. This doesn't say if they are an ideal scale in terms of sustainability, and the discussion on the ideal size of cities has been going on for several decades. There's no answer to that. What we did try to do in the report was not to ignore the fact that different cities of different sizes in different contexts have different problems and also require different solutions. So we did not do a study on what's the ideal or optimal dimension of a city, but we are putting a lot of effort on making sure that every analysis that we do and every case study that we present, any potential pathway, takes into account the fact that we have cities of very different sizes, and particularly cities of less than 500,000 people have more than half of the population. So we need to be addressing them as well. So the quick answer is we did not find an optimal dimension, but we are trying to consider all the dimensions of cities that are out there in order to make the report useful or significant to all these different types of cities.
Thank you, Diego. All right, we're down to our last couple of questions. For Giancarlo, how significant is the risk of urban centers becoming more delinked from their hinterlands, where a significant proportion of the ecosystems on which they depend come from or originate?
Well, I really don't have a big answer for that. I mean, it's a huge challenge, and mainly one of the well, my concern on that is that small cities that are going to be our main driver in terms of urban growth in the future will need to think about that, try to rethink their own economies, trying to be more local. Of course, we know that globalized cities tend to have globalized linkages in terms of energy, materials, information, even population. So we need to think on having in mind the experiences of urban sprawling and ultra globalized cities that not necessarily are too efficient or, in other words, sustainable and low carbon cities. So I think it's only a matter of taking into account the non-desirable experiences that we already have, and think how we're going to redirect the business as usual tendency, mainly for these cities that are going to grow in the next decades.
Thank you, Gian, for making a good attempt at that one. Back to Diego. Are we thinking of natural capital accounting in the Geo4Cities publication?
I was actually typing the response to Eugene. Thank you for the question, because the short answer is no. This is not part of the analysis that we are making in the GeoCities report. Short answer.
Thank you. And then back to Gian for the last question here. And thank you everyone for your
Pierre,
interest.
Before you go to the question, before I forget,
Yes.
the gender imbalance that you all see in this panel is quite the opposite of what happens with the gender imbalance that we have in the report, where we have all CLAs are male and female in each chapter, except for one chapter where we have all female authors. So we apologize for this imbalance. It was an agenda issue, but it's not what happens in the report.
Yes.
Sorry, Pierre, I cut you.
Yeah. We definitely have a very good gender lens on the issues as well. So last question. Thank you very much, Giancarlo. There are major problems with cropland degradation and intensity of farming in the UK. Crop growing land will be fully degraded in 30 to 40 years. This would limit growth of urban. Oh, I'm losing the question here. Limit growth of urban spaces. So yes, I don't know if you have a comment on that, or if it's just a comment from Paul rather than a question.
Well, just to say something regarding food production, one of the imperatives for the future and currently already is food production of healthy fresh food mainly. So we have been experiencing in the last decades a transition from more healthy diets towards more industrialized diets. That transition is already being an issue in terms of health in several countries. Mexico, it's one of them, with we're in the first, second rank of obesity. What I'm trying to say is that we need to rethink not only diets in one hand, but on the other, the ways we produce food in a context in which rural population is going to shrink. And if we try to go further in this business as usual production pattern based on oil, meaning fertilizers and all that type of inputs that industrialized food production needs, we will certainly be in trouble in terms of decoupling consumption of fossil fuels and food production. So there are a lot of alternatives that are currently being implemented in terms of peri-urban production of food, sustainable production of urban and peri-urban food production. And there are a lot of co-benefits related in terms of jobs as well, and in terms of access to healthy products, and therefore reducing health issues in cities. So I think there are a lot of issues that can be tackled at the same time if we try to be innovative in terms of how we produce our food in a context of a greater urbanized world.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think that's a very good point to end on. I think the idea of integrated policy that takes into account broad systems rather than individual issues is a very strong theme in the Geo6, and I expect it will be a strong theme in the Geo for Cities. So I think that's a good point to end on. Thank you everyone for sticking with us through the question and answer session. Very good questions, and I want to thank you on behalf of all the presenters and UNEP, because I think as we advance with the development of the Geo for Cities, your thoughts and ideas will be very important for us. I want to thank everyone, and we'll leave it there.